Wanted to ask you about the phrase doubling up. Could you just explain what that means?
Demographers use the term doubling up to describe basically any co-residence with adults beyond what we think of as the nuclear family unit. So mother, romantic partner, and minor children. So doubled up households are those that include any adult besides the householder and the householder's romantic partner. So for most kids who live doubled up, this means that they live with a grandparent, but doubled up kids also live with other extended family and with non-relatives.
What are some of the benefits or reasons why we see families doubling up?
There are definitely economic benefits to doubling up. So families who double up as what I call a guest, meaning they move into someone else's home, often get lower cost housing than they would otherwise be able to find on the private market. So for example, some of the parents I talked to said they might have to access emergency shelter if they weren't able to double up. And then others said they could afford their own housing, but it might be, for example, a cramped apartment or in a dangerous neighborhood, or it might just cost all of their money in rent. And so doubling up for these families provided a good economic alternative. And then for the hosts, the people who are allowing the other family to live with them, doubling up can also have economic benefits. So most guests contribute financially to the household. So doubling up can be financially beneficial to hosts as well. And of course, hosts and guests can both share food and other resources. And having more adults in the household means there are more people who are able to help with things like childcare, with things like elder care, help around the house, things like that.
What are some of the challenges when you have these different generations together and these different family units under one roof?
I think that living together with other people is just hard. So I mentioned some of the economic benefits of living doubled up, but both hosts and guests tend to be economically disadvantaged. And so doubling up can sort of strain these already limited resources even further. So doubling up definitely comes with economic risks as well. But then, as I mentioned, living together is simply hard on an interpersonal basis as well. So even in households where there's enough resources to go around, enough space, and these households are often pretty highly conflictual. So I saw disagreement over everything from child rearing to conflicting lifestyles to just how the household is supposed to be kept.
What are some of the boundaries that need to be set when families are in this doubling up situation?
I definitely saw a lot of ambiguity in expectations and a lot of disagreement that sort of stemmed from that. So obviously living together is difficult, but to the extent that families can discuss this arrangement before moving in and sort of get everyone on the same page about expectations, I think that that can definitely reduce conflict within the household. I also think that, so you asked about recommendations, and I think that in this time, like particularly right now during COVID, I think that it raises a lot of special questions about how families are supposed to be living together. So families in my study, I obviously wasn't talking to people during the pandemic, but they talked to me about how they were concerned that they didn't have control over the household environment. And so, for example, people were able to come in and out of the household, people maybe that they didn't think were great influences on their children. And obviously during a pandemic, you might not just be concerned about bad influences coming in, you might also be concerned about basically anyone coming in. And so I think the pandemic can raise some sort of special challenges for families. And I think that my recommendation for dealing with that as much as possible is sort of based on the experiences of the families that I spoke to. So what some of them did was when they were living in someone else's home, defined a small area of the home. Oftentimes it was just a bedroom, but at least have some area where they could have a little bit of privacy and a little bit of control over their surroundings, and a place where they might feel a little more safe whenever other visitors come into the household if the other household members aren't practicing social distancing.
Do you have any tips for the way you can get that conversation going if you have people coming in and out of the house?
In my study, what I found was that how parents experienced doubling up really varied by whether they were the host, the person who was letting the other family live with them, or they were the guest who was doubled up in someone else's home. And so within these households, hosts expect to maintain authority over the home and its inhabitants. And so they're really in a position of sort of power over the guest, who oftentimes needs their help and needs them to provide this housing for them. So I think that getting that conversation going can be particularly tricky, and I don't know that I have any easy solutions for it. But what I can say is that given that power dynamic, I think that it's all the more important to have these conversations up front so that everyone understands and is on the same page about that to the extent possible.
Could you tell me a little bit about the study itself that we were talking about? How many families did you involve?
We know that rates of doubling up have been increasing, but to my knowledge, no one has gone and asked families what it's like to live in these households. So I interviewed about 60 doubled up parents with young children about their experiences doubling up. And the study they're talking about focused specifically on the experiences of the 52 mothers in my sample. So these parents were a subsample of a larger study of residential decision making. And that study took a sample of a pretty broad cross section of households with young children from the Cleveland and Dallas metro areas. And they interviewed them annually for 2 years. And so for any parent that doubled up at some point during those 2 years, I brought them into my sample and I completed additional interviews focused specifically on their experiences doubling up. And so from these interviews, what I found was that, as I mentioned, whether the mother was the host or the guest was really central to how she experienced doubling up. So mothers understand having their own home as really key to fulfilling their ideals of adulthood and of good parenting. So this manifested in two main ways. The first was just that cultural ideals led mothers to perceive that doubling up in someone else's home was incompatible with being an adult, and then also with her ideals of family life. So mothers described wanting to be independent and provide their own housing for their own family. And they described wanting to experience this sort of prototypical family life with a mother, often a romantic partner, and children, all living together independently in their own household. But then the sense of incompatibility between doubling up and what it meant to be an adult and a good parent was also really reinforced in their daily interactions. So as I mentioned, mothers were subject to rules and expectations set by householders. So for example, one mother described to me how she was living in her friend's house and her friend had rules about when they could run the air conditioning. And if she didn't adhere to those rules, she was setting herself up to be lectured at, much she felt like a child. And then the second area was mothers faced reduced control over childbearing because they had lower authority within the household. So, for example, one mother described how when she had her own home, she would put her kids down to bed at 8 p.m. every night sharp, start preparing for the next day. But when she was living in someone else's home, she didn't have the authority to control who came in and out of the house and when. And so the house always had visitors coming in and out late at night, kept her kids up, disrupted their sleep, and threw them off their routine. So these examples show how, because the householders had authority within the home and then also over its inhabitants, it meant that mothers faced reduced control over their own daily life, but then also over their childbearing.
A couple of months from now, people may come out of this in a shakier economic situation. Do you see that could lead to more doubling up?
Doubling up has been increasing over the last couple decades, and we know that it definitely increased at a pretty rapid rate during the Great Recession. So I don't see any reason to think that with the rates of unemployment going up, we know that unemployment is tied to doubling up. So it seems likely that many families are probably going to be pushed into doubled up situations, particularly situations where they need to rely on others for housing. And I think that even families who are able to maintain employment but have their income, their hours cut and things like that, they'll probably struggle to afford rent, and this can lead to a lot of doubled up situations. So yeah, I think that the pandemic is certainly making it likely that we'll continue to see rising rates of doubling up in the future.
When the moms were concerned about not having that control of who's coming in and coming out, was it young adults that they didn't have control over? Was it older adults in the home?
I don't think that it was any specific age group. So I had some mothers, for example, talk to me about they were doubled up with maybe friends, and their friends had friends who they thought were not very savory characters. They didn't want them around their children, but they weren't able to set those rules. But then we also had mothers who were fine with the people who were coming in. Mother was living with her father, and her siblings would always come over to visit. It was a family house. And this mother was fine with the siblings coming in, but it was just the time of day that they were coming in and the lack of control. And so I think that it can be all age ranges, and I think that it can be all types of people that mothers were concerned about. And I think that during the pandemic, you can even think about this in non-doubled up households. You know, if you have your teenage child living at home and they're going out and maybe seeing friends whenever you don't know about it, or their friends want to stop by the house and you're trying to control that. I think that a lot of the difficulties of doubled up households we're probably seeing with a broader range of households now because people have particular concerns about visiting the home.
Is there anything I didn't ask you, Hope, that you would want to make sure that people know?
The most important thing that I took away from this study is that the mothers that I spoke to who were doubled up in someone else's home were very eager to have a home of their own. And doubling up incurred these pretty hefty psychological costs for them. And so I think that for policymakers and for general people, it's important to think about these psychological costs whenever we think about what it means that doubling up is becoming increasingly common and that housing costs are increasingly difficult to pay. And I think that it's particularly important whenever we think about policies that might be contributing to this rise of doubling up. So, for example, the low level of public housing assistance. We should certainly be weighing these psychological costs whenever we think about the limited availability of housing assistance.